Imagine being born into a world without grocery stores, without baby formula, without pediatricians or blenders or any of the things we assume infants need to survive. For most of human history, that was reality. Before agriculture reshaped everything, babies were fed in ways that seem almost alien to us now. And yet, somehow, those methods worked spectacularly well for hundreds of thousands of years. Here's what nobody tells you about prehistoric infant feeding. It wasn't a matter of making do with limited options. It was a sophisticated, deeply social system that kept babies alive in conditions that would terrify most modern parents. The foragers who roamed Earth before farming weren't struggling to figure out how to nourish their young. They'd already solved that problem in ways we're only beginning to understand. The conventional story goes something like this. Ancient people were primitive. They did the best they could with what they had. Then agriculture arrived and improved everything, including how we fed babies. That narrative is comforting, but it's also completely backward in several important ways. Let's start with the most fundamental question. What did babies actually eat before anyone planted a seed? The answer begins with breast milk, obviously. But that's where the simplicity ends and the fascinating complexity starts. In forager societies, breastfeeding wasn't a 6-month commitment or a 1-year milestone. It was a relationship that stretched across years, often 3 to 4, sometimes longer. This wasn't cultural preference or tradition for its own sake. It was biology meeting environment in the most practical way possible. When you're moving through landscapes without refrigeration, without storage containers, without any way to preserve food safely for a tiny human with a vulnerable immune system, extended breastfeeding makes perfect sense. Breast milk is always available, always the right temperature, always nutritionally complete, and it comes with antibodies that protect against the specific diseases present in that particular environment. It's not just food, it's medicine, immune defense, and hydration all packaged together. But here's where it gets interesting. Extended breastfeeding in forager groups wasn't just about nutrition, it was contraception. When women breastfeed frequently, day and night, their bodies suppress ovulation. This is called lactational amenorrhea, and it's not perfectly reliable, but it's effective enough that it naturally spaces births about 3 to 4 years apart in populations that practice intensive breastfeeding. Forager women didn't need to calculate optimal birth spacing. Their bodies did it automatically through the simple act of feeding their babies on demand. This spacing wasn't accidental. It was survival. Carrying one infant while pregnant is manageable. Carrying a toddler, a newborn, and being pregnant again while moving camp every few weeks. That's a recipe for disaster. The human body figured out the math long before anyone could write equations. Now you might be thinking this sounds idyllic but impractical. What happened when a mother died? What about twins? What if milk production was insufficient? That's where the social structure becomes crucial. Forager groups operated on a principle that modern societies have largely abandoned: cooperative breeding. Babies weren't just their mother's responsibility. They were the group's responsibility. This wasn't altruism or cultural niceness. It was practical survival strategy embedded so deeply that it became instinct. When a mother couldn't nurse, other lactating women in the group would. This practice, called cross-nursing or allo-nursing, was completely normal. It wasn't a crisis intervention. It was standard operating procedure. Women would nurse each other's babies while gathering food, during travel, or simply to give a mother a break. The idea that only one woman's milk should touch one specific baby would have seemed bizarre and unnecessarily risky. The biological machinery supported this beautifully. Women who are around other nursing mothers and babies often begin lactating themselves, even if they haven't recently given birth. Grandmothers sometimes relactated to help nurse grandchildren. The human body is far more flexible about lactation than modern medicine typically acknowledges. But breast milk, even with this extensive social support, wasn't the only thing babies consumed. This is where the story gets genuinely strange by modern standards. The introduction of solid foods in forager societies didn't follow any schedule recommended by paediatricians. There were no carefully pureed first foods, no rice cereal, no progression from smooth to chunky textures over months of careful introduction. Instead, there was pre-mastication. Adults would chew food thoroughly, breaking it down with their own saliva and teeth, then transfer that food directly into an infant's mouth. This wasn't occasional. This was how babies transitioned to solid foods. Your grandmother did this. Her grandmother did this. Every grandmother back through time did this, until we get to forager societies, where it wasn't something grandmothers did. It was something everyone did. Before you recoil, consider what's actually happening. Adult saliva contains enzymes that begin breaking down starches and proteins. Chewing reduces food to a consistency that tiny, toothless mouths can manage. The process also transfers oral bacteria from caregiver to infant, which sounds terrible until you realize this is how babies develop their oral microbiome, the bacterial ecosystem that protects their mouths and digestive systems. Modern parents panic about sterilizing everything. Forager parents did the opposite, deliberately exposing babies to microbes in controlled, gradual ways. Both approaches are trying to protect babies, but they're operating from completely different assumptions about how immune systems develop. The foods being pre-masticated varied wildly depending on environment. In tropical regions, fruits were mashed and shared early. In Arctic zones, babies received pre-masticated fish, seal, and caribou. In temperate forests, nuts, tubers, and small game formed the base. What didn't vary was the method. Adults chewed, babies swallowed. This practice had another benefit nobody talks about. It was a powerful bonding mechanism. Feeding a baby this way requires close physical contact, eye contact, attention to the baby's cues about hunger and fullness. It's impossible to pre-masticate food while scrolling through your phone or watching television. The act demanded presence. And it wasn't just mothers doing this. Fathers pre-masticated food. Grandparents did. Older siblings did. Aunts and uncles did. The entire social group participated in feeding infants, creating bonds between babies and multiple caregivers. This distributed care meant that babies weren't solely attached to one person, which made sense in a world where any adult might die suddenly from injury, disease, or predation. Multiple attachment figures weren't a luxury, they were insurance. But what about the elephant in the room? The thing every modern parent worries about constantly: choking. Forager parents weren't stupid or careless. They understood risk. But they also understood that learning to eat is inherently risky, and that risk can't be eliminated, only managed. Babies in forager societies were held while eating, usually in someone's lap, always attended. Adults didn't hand babies food and walk away. They stayed present, watching, ready to respond. The foods themselves were prepared to minimize risk. Tough items were chewed longer, hard items were avoided until babies had teeth. Supervision was constant, not because parents were paranoid, but because feeding time was social time, and babies were always in the middle of the action. Here's something that might sound controversial. Forager babies probably choked less than modern babies. Why? Because they were never eating alone, never eating in car seats or strollers, never given food as a distraction while adults did something else. Every meal was a social event with multiple attentive adults present. Modern parents are often isolated, managing meals while simultaneously cooking, cleaning, and trying to keep households running. Forager parents had the entire group's attention focused on the baby during feeding times. This raises an uncomfortable question. Have we made infant feeding safer, or have we just made it more isolated and anxious? The nutritional content of these early solid foods was also radically different from modern baby food. There was no rice cereal, no pureed carrots from a jar, no organic pouches. Instead, babies received whatever the adults were eating, just processed differently. This meant babies were exposed to a huge variety of flavors and textures from very early on. A baby in a coastal forager group might taste dozens of different fish species, various seaweeds, shellfish, and coastal plants before turning 2. A baby in a forest group might experience an equally diverse array of game animals, nuts, berries, and roots. This early flavor exposure had profound effects. It prevented picky eating because there was no concept of kid food versus adult food. Everyone ate the same things, just prepared differently based on ability to chew. A baby who'd been eating pre-masticated venison since 6 months old didn't suddenly refuse meat as a toddler. That food was familiar, safe, normal. Modern parents often struggle with picky eating because we've created this artificial category of bland, simple baby foods, then expect children to suddenly accept complex flavors and textures. We've manufactured a problem that didn't exist in forager societies. The other advantage of diverse early feeding was nutritional. Babies weren't getting the same pureed sweet potato day after day. They were getting micronutrients from a wide range of sources, which meant deficiencies were rare, even without any understanding of vitamins or minerals. The variety itself provided insurance against nutritional gaps. But here's where the story takes another turn. What happened during food scarcity? Forager groups didn't have consistent food supplies. There were abundant seasons and lean seasons, successful hunts and failed hunts, years of plenty and years of hunger. How did babies survive when food was scarce? The answer reveals something profound about how these societies prioritized resources. During lean times, babies continued nursing far longer than they would have otherwise. The breast milk supply didn't depend on immediate food availability the way solid food did. A mother's body would pull from her own reserves to maintain milk production, essentially buffering the baby from short-term food scarcity. This is why the extended breastfeeding wasn't just cultural preference. It was a biological buffer against environmental unpredictability. Babies who could still nurse at 2 or 3 years old had a survival advantage during famines that babies who'd been weaned earlier didn't have. The group dynamics during scarcity also shifted. Babies and young children were fed first, not last. This wasn't sentimentality. It was practical. Adults could survive hunger better than children could. A healthy adult might lose weight during a lean season, but recover when food returned. A malnourished baby might die or suffer permanent developmental damage. So the calculus was simple. Feed the most vulnerable first, and the group's long-term survival improves. This required adults to accept hunger themselves, which sounds noble, but was really just rational resource management. There's a deeper pattern here that modern societies have completely lost. Forager infant feeding wasn't a separate category of activity. It was woven into every other aspect of life. Women gathered food with babies on their backs. Men returned from hunts and immediately shared food with the youngest members of the group. Feeding babies wasn't scheduled around other activities. Other activities were structured around babies' needs. This wasn't because forager societies were more enlightened or more child-centered. It was because babies who weren't integrated into daily life had lower survival rates, and groups that didn't prioritize infant feeding eventually disappeared. We're descended from the groups that figured this out. The archaeological evidence supports all of this, though it's frustratingly indirect. We can't dig up breast milk or pre-masticated food, but we can examine infant and child mortality rates, growth patterns in skeletal remains, and the timing of weaning based on isotope analysis of ancient teeth. What that evidence shows is striking. In most forager populations, babies who survived the dangerous first year of life had excellent survival rates through early childhood. The growth patterns were steady and healthy. Weaning ages clustered around 3 to 4 years. And perhaps most tellingly, there's little evidence of the nutritional deficiency diseases that plague agricultural societies. That last point deserves emphasis because it contradicts everything we've been taught about progress. When humans started farming, infant and child health got worse, not better. Agricultural babies were weaned earlier onto gruels made from grains. They showed more signs of nutritional stress, more infections, more growth disruptions. The Forager system wasn't perfect. Infant mortality existed. Accidents happened. But for babies who survived birth and the vulnerable newborn period, the feeding practices that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years worked remarkably well. Which brings us to the question nobody wants to ask. If these methods worked so well, why did we abandon them? The answer isn't about nutrition or infant health. It's about what happened when humans stopped moving and started staying in one place. When populations settled and began farming, everything about infant feeding had to change. Not because the old ways were inadequate, but because they were incompatible with the new way of life agriculture demanded. That transformation, and what it cost, is a story that reaches right into your kitchen today. The shift to agriculture didn't happen overnight. It took thousands of years unfolding differently across continents, driven by climate changes, population pressures, and probably a fair amount of accident. But once it started, there was no going back. And babies paid the price first. The fundamental problem was simple. Farming required staying put. You can't plant fields and then wander off for 3 months following animal migrations. You can't tend crops while ranging across 50 miles of territory. Agriculture meant settlement, and settlement meant women could no longer carry babies everywhere while gathering food across vast landscapes. The entire system that had made extended breastfeeding and on-demand nursing possible began to crumble. At first glance, settlement should have made infant feeding easier. You're not moving constantly. You can store food, you can build permanent structures, but every advantage came with hidden costs that nobody anticipated because nobody was planning this transition. It just happened, generation by generation, as groups experimented with cultivating plants and found themselves increasingly tied to specific plots of land. One immediate change was birth spacing. Among mobile foragers, women typically had babies 3 to 4 years apart. This wasn't deliberate family planning in the modern sense. It was a biological consequence of extended breastfeeding and high physical activity levels. Frequent nursing suppresses ovulation, though not perfectly. The combination of nursing patterns and the energy demands of constant movement kept fertility naturally lower. When women settled, birth intervals shortened. Suddenly babies were arriving every 2 years, sometimes faster. This alone transformed infant feeding from manageable to overwhelming. Imagine you're nursing a 2-year-old when a newborn arrives. Among mobile foragers, this was rare enough that the community could adapt. Extra help from grandmothers, more food sharing, adjustments to the group's movement patterns. In settled agricultural villages, it became common. Women found themselves nursing 2 children simultaneously, while also grinding grain, tending gardens, and managing households. Something had to give, and what gave was the older child's access to breast milk. Weaning ages dropped, but here's where it gets brutal. The foods available for weaning in agricultural societies were terrible for babies. Grains became the staple crops: wheat, barley, rice, millet, corn, depending on the region. These aren't bad foods for adults. They're calorie-dense and can sustain large populations. But for babies, they're nutritionally inadequate. Grains are low in protein, low in essential fats, and lacking in several crucial vitamins and minerals. They're also hard to digest, especially for infants whose digestive systems evolved expecting breast milk for years, not grain porridge at 6 months. The evidence shows up in ancient skeletons. When archaeologists examine the bones and teeth of children from early agricultural societies, they find something disturbing. Compared to forager children, agricultural kids show more signs of nutritional stress, more stunted growth, more evidence of disease. Their teeth tell the story most clearly through something called enamel hyperplasia, which are defects in tooth enamel that form during childhood, when nutrition is inadequate or disease is present. Agricultural children have significantly more of these defects than forager children did. This wasn't ignorance. Agricultural mothers knew breast milk was better, but they were trapped by circumstances. More babies arriving faster, less mobility to maintain the forager feeding patterns, and increasing labour demands as farming intensified, all conspired to force earlier weaning onto inferior foods. The social structure of agricultural villages also changed things. In small forager bands, everyone knew everyone. Babies could nurse from multiple women if needed. Grandmothers were intimately involved in childcare. The entire group functioned as an extended support network. Agricultural villages were larger, more stratified, more divided by labour and status. The intimate communal care that characterised forager child-rearing became harder to maintain. Women increasingly managed infant feeding alone, or with just their immediate family, and that isolation made everything harder. Another factor nobody discusses is monotony. Forager diets were incredibly diverse, sometimes more than 200 different plant and animal species consumed throughout the year. This diversity meant breast milk composition was rich and varied, reflecting the mother's wide-ranging diet. Agricultural diets narrowed dramatically. If you're eating mostly wheat, your breast milk reflects that. It's still breast milk, still valuable, but the micronutrient profile isn't what it was when humans ate everything they could catch, dig up, or pick. The decline in breast milk quality, combined with earlier weaning and poor weaning foods, created a perfect storm of infant malnutrition. And because agricultural villages were densely populated compared to forager camps, diseases spread faster. Malnourished babies with compromised immune systems living in close quarters with many other children. You can predict what happened next. Infant and child mortality rates climbed. Not immediately, not in ways that would have been obvious to people living through the transition. But over generations, the archaeological record is clear. Agriculture made childhood more dangerous, yet populations grew anyway. This is the paradox that confuses people. If agricultural babies were less healthy, why did agricultural societies outcompete forager groups? The answer is numbers. Agriculture could support much larger populations despite higher infant mortality. If you have twice as many babies and half of them die, you still end up with more surviving children than a forager group having fewer babies with better survival rates. It's grim mathematics, but it explains why agriculture spread. There's also the question of what mothers knew versus what they could do about it. By the time problems became apparent, several generations into the agricultural transition, going back wasn't an option. The population had already grown too large to sustain through foraging. The landscape had been altered by farming. The knowledge of wild food sources had begun to fade. You can't unsettle a settled population, not without catastrophic consequences. So societies adapted badly, but they adapted. One adaptation was animal milk. Once humans domesticated cattle, goats, and sheep, animal milk became available as a supplementary food for babies. This was a genuine innovation that probably saved countless lives. Animal milk isn't nutritionally identical to human milk, but it's far superior to grain porridge. The problem was availability. Not everyone owned animals. Not all animals produce surplus milk. And without refrigeration, fresh milk spoiled quickly. So animal milk helped, but it didn't solve the underlying crisis of early weaning in agricultural societies. The other adaptation was simply accepting higher infant mortality as normal. This sounds cruel, but when you live in a world where half of all babies die before age 5, you develop cultural practices around that reality. Babies weren't fully named or integrated into the community until they survived their first year or two. Grief was ritualized but contained. The emotional calculus of parenthood shifted in ways that we, living in a world where infant death is rare, find almost incomprehensible. This wasn't callousness. It was psychological survival. What's striking is how long these patterns persisted. We're not talking about a brief transitional period. From the origins of agriculture, roughly 10,000 years ago, until maybe 200 years ago, most human babies were weaned too early onto inadequate foods, and most societies simply accepted the resulting high infant mortality as an unchangeable fact of life. That's 10,000 years of suboptimal infant feeding normalized across cultures worldwide. Only the specific grains and the local weaning practices varied. The underlying problem remained constant. This historical reality undermines a lot of modern assumptions about traditional wisdom and natural parenting. When people talk about getting back to ancestral feeding practices, which ancestors are we talking about? The foragers who breastfed for years and had relatively healthy children? Or the agricultural societies that weaned babies at 6 months onto rice gruel and accepted that half of them wouldn't survive? Both are part of human history. Both left their marks on our biology and culture. But they're not the same thing at all. The Industrial Revolution made everything worse before it made anything better. When populations moved from farms to cities, infant feeding became even more precarious. Urban mothers often worked in factories, making extended breastfeeding impossible. Wet nurses became a booming industry. Poor women selling their milk to feed wealthier women's babies, while their own children were weaned onto whatever was cheapest. The mortality rates for babies raised on early industrial infant foods were catastrophic. Some cities saw infant mortality rates above 50%. This wasn't the distant past. This was the 1800s, well within the historical record, thoroughly documented by reformers who were horrified by what they were witnessing. The first commercial infant formulas appeared in the late 19th century, marketed as scientific improvements over breast milk. They were nothing of the kind. Early formulas were based on cow's milk with added sugars, and basically whatever the manufacturer thought sounded scientific. They were expensive, often contaminated, and nutritionally inadequate. Babies raised on these formulas died at appalling rates. But the marketing was sophisticated, and the promise of liberation from the constraints of breastfeeding was appealing to women trapped in impossible situations, needing to work, living in poverty, without family support systems. What finally began to improve infant survival wasn't better infant formula. It was pasteurization, cleaner water supplies, basic sanitation, and eventually antibiotics. Once you could keep milk from killing babies through bacterial contamination, and once you could treat the infections that malnourished infants inevitably developed, survival rates began to climb. Better formulas helped, but they were never the primary driver of declining infant mortality. That credit belongs to public health infrastructure, not food science. Modern infant formula, the kind developed in the mid-20th century, finally became nutritionally adequate. Not identical to breast milk, but close enough that babies could survive and even thrive on it. This was a genuine breakthrough, though it's complicated by the aggressive and often unethical marketing that formula companies deployed, particularly in developing countries where clean water and sanitation weren't available. The Nestlé boycotts of the 1970s and 80s weren't about whether formula could work in ideal conditions. They were about companies marketing formula in conditions where it was almost guaranteed to cause infant deaths. Today, we live in a strange moment. In wealthy countries, we have the technology to feed babies adequately, whether they're breastfed or formula-fed. But we've also developed intense cultural wars around infant feeding that have almost nothing to do with nutrition and everything to do with identity, class, and competing visions of motherhood. The science is clear that breast milk has advantages, particularly for immune system development and protection against infections. It's also clear that modern formula is safe and nutritionally sufficient. Yet the discussions around infant feeding are rarely calm or scientific. They're charged with emotion, judgment, and historical baggage that nobody fully understands. Part of that baggage is the 10,000 years of agricultural infant feeding failure that we've collectively forgotten. We don't realize that for most of human history, after the adoption of farming, babies were fed in ways that we'd now consider dangerously inadequate. We don't recognize that the relatively recent improvements in infant nutrition and survival are achievements, not a return to some natural state. And we don't acknowledge that the forager feeding patterns that actually worked well are completely incompatible with modern life, not just slightly inconvenient, but genuinely impossible for most people. This is why the debates about breast versus bottle miss the point entirely. The real question is what we lost when humans settled down, had more babies, and built societies that required women to do things other than carry infants constantly while those infants nursed on demand for years. We gained civilization, agriculture, cities, technology, everything that makes modern life possible. But babies paid the evolutionary cost, and we're still figuring out how to feed them in ways that don't require either returning to a forager lifestyle or accepting the compromises that agriculture forced on our ancestors. The other thing we've forgotten is that agricultural societies didn't just change how babies were fed. They changed the entire social structure around motherhood, and those changes made adequate infant feeding almost impossible. In forager societies, mothers had extensive support networks: grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, other women in the group. Alloparenting, the term anthropologists use, wasn't a nice bonus. It was essential infrastructure. A mother could hand off her infant when she needed to gather food, rest, or deal with another child. The baby was never far from someone who could provide care, comfort, and often milk if another lactating woman was available. Agricultural settlements broke this system in ways that weren't immediately obvious. On the surface, you'd think farming villages would provide even better support networks. Everyone lived close together. Families were large, and communities were stable. But agriculture created new demands on women's labour that foraging hadn't. Fields needed tending, harvests needed processing, animals needed care. The work was constant, season-dependent, and couldn't be easily interrupted. A woman gathering wild plants could stop when her baby needed attention. A woman planting rice in a flooded field couldn't. This created an impossible tension. Babies still needed the same level of care and feeding that human infants had always required. But mothers now had work obligations that directly conflicted with providing that care. Something had to give, and it was always the baby's needs that bent. Not because mothers were negligent or didn't care, but because survival of the entire family depended on agricultural labour. If the crops failed, everyone starved, not just the infant. The solution in many agricultural societies was to delegate infant care to whoever wasn't essential for fieldwork. Often this meant older children, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, carrying babies on their backs while adults worked. These child caregivers did their best, but they couldn't breastfeed, didn't have adult judgment about infant needs, and were themselves still children dealing with their own developmental requirements. The babies suffered accordingly. In other cases, infants were left in the care of elderly relatives who were no longer capable of heavy labour. This worked better than childcare, but it still meant babies were separated from their mothers for long stretches, making frequent breastfeeding impossible. The solution was supplemental feeding, which meant all the problems with contaminated animal milk or inadequate grain porridges that we've already discussed. Some societies tried to maintain the forager pattern of carrying infants during work, but agricultural labour made this genuinely dangerous. A baby strapped to your back while you're bending over planting rice can slip into the water. An infant on your hip while you're using a sickle to harvest grain can be injured by the blade. The work wasn't compatible with constant infant carrying in ways that gathering wild plants had been. The economic pressures were relentless. Agricultural societies could support larger populations, which meant they did. Fertility increased, families grew, and the spacing between children shortened. This meant women were often pregnant or nursing almost continuously during their reproductive years. The physical demands were enormous, and the nutritional strain on mothers became severe. Undernourished mothers produced less milk, which made supplemental feeding more necessary, which increased infant mortality, which incentivized having more children to compensate for the losses. A vicious cycle that agricultural societies couldn't escape. What's striking is how long it took for anyone to recognize this as a systemic problem rather than just individual family tragedies. For thousands of years, high infant mortality was simply accepted as normal. Babies died. Everyone knew babies died. Religious explanations filled the gap where medical understanding didn't exist. God's will, fate, original sin, demon possession. Anything except acknowledging that the way society was organized made it nearly impossible to keep babies alive. Even when reformers began to notice patterns, the solutions they proposed rarely addressed the fundamental incompatibility between agricultural labor demands and infant needs. Instead, they focused on moral instruction, teaching mothers the proper way to care for children, as if individual behavior rather than structural constraints was the problem. The assumption was that mothers were simply ignorant or negligent, not that they were trapped in an economic system that made adequate infant care impossible. This blindness persisted well into the industrial era. Factory work made the situation even worse. Agricultural labor was at least somewhat flexible. You could sometimes bring a baby to the field, even if it wasn't ideal. Factory work allowed no such compromises. The machines ran on schedules that didn't accommodate infant feeding. Women had to choose between earning wages their families needed to survive and providing the care their babies needed to survive. Often they tried to do both and failed at both. The wet nurse industry exploded during industrialization, not because wealthy women suddenly became more vain or lazy, but because working-class women needed someone to feed their babies while they worked 12-hour shifts. But wet nurses were expensive, and most working families couldn't afford them. The cheaper alternative was artificial feeding, which meant the babies of poor working women had the worst survival chances of all. Too poor for wet nurses, too desperate to exclusively breastfeed, and living in urban environments where contaminated water and milk were nearly guaranteed. Reformers saw the dead babies and blamed the mothers. They launched campaigns for maternal education, assuming the problem was knowledge rather than resources. They taught working-class women about hygiene and proper infant care, while ignoring the fact that these women had no access to clean water, lived in overcrowded tenements, and worked jobs that gave them no time to implement any of the advice. It was a masterclass in missing the point. What finally began to change things wasn't moral reform or maternal education. It was the same public health infrastructure that improved survival rates generally. Clean water systems meant contaminated milk killed fewer babies. Pasteurization meant the milk that did get contaminated was at least somewhat safer. Labor reforms meant women weren't working quite as many hours under quite as brutal conditions. These weren't changes aimed specifically at infant feeding. They were broad improvements in living conditions that happened to make infant survival more possible. But even as survival rates improved, the fundamental tension never got resolved. Modern mothers still face impossible choices between economic participation and infant care. The specific manifestations have changed. We're not talking about factory shifts or field work for most women in wealthy countries anymore. But the underlying problem is the same. Human infants evolved to be cared for in ways that modern economic life makes impractical or impossible. This is why the mommy wars around infant feeding are so bitter and so intractable. They're not really about breast versus bottle. They're about the fact that we've built a society that's fundamentally incompatible with the biological needs of human infants. And instead of acknowledging that structural problem, we've turned it into a referendum on individual maternal choices. Women who breastfeed are told they're privileged and judgmental. Women who formula feed are told they're selfish and lazy. Both groups are actually just trying to survive in a system that sets them up to fail. The reality is that most of human history since agriculture has been characterized by inadequate infant feeding. The forager pattern that worked well for hundreds of thousands of years became impossible once we settled down. The agricultural solutions were stopgaps that killed enormous numbers of babies. The Industrial Revolution made things worse before public health improvements made them better. And modern life still hasn't solved the basic problem of how to feed human infants in ways that match their evolutionary needs, while also allowing their mothers to participate in economic life. We've made enormous progress. Modern formula is nutritionally adequate in ways that nothing before the mid-20th century was. Public health infrastructure means babies in wealthy countries are unlikely to die from contaminated food or water. Medical care means the infections and malnutrition that used to kill infants can often be treated. These are genuine achievements that we shouldn't minimize, but we also shouldn't pretend we've solved the underlying problem. We've just made it survivable. Babies still need more or less constant care and frequent feeding. Mothers still need to work, sleep, and occasionally exist as people separate from their infants. Society still hasn't figured out how to make those two realities compatible without requiring enormous sacrifices from mothers, infants, or both. The historical perspective makes this clearer. For the vast majority of human existence, we fed babies in ways that worked pretty well. Then we adopted agriculture and spent 10,000 years feeding babies in ways that killed them at horrifying rates. We've only recently developed the technology and infrastructure to feed babies adequately under modern conditions, and even that only works in places with clean water, reliable food supplies, and access to medical care. Most of human history is a story of babies dying because we couldn't figure out how to feed them once we stopped living as foragers. That's the context we're missing when we debate infant feeding today. We think we're arguing about personal choices and individual circumstances. We're actually arguing about the unsolved legacy of agricultural civilization. How do you feed a human infant in a world that wasn't designed for human infant needs? How do you balance the biological requirements of a species that evolved to live in small mobile groups with the economic requirements of a species that now lives in massive sedentary civilizations? These aren't questions with easy answers. They might not be questions with answers at all, but recognizing that they're the real questions, not whether breast or bottle is morally superior, would at least point the discussion in a more useful direction. We can't go back to being foragers. We can't undo agriculture or industrialization or modern economic life. But we could at least be honest about the costs those transitions imposed on the most vulnerable members of our species and stop pretending that individual maternal choices are the problem when the real problem is 10,000 years old and baked into the structure of civilization itself. That brings us to wet nursing, which reveals just how desperate agricultural societies were to solve the infant feeding problem. If you couldn't feed your baby yourself and animal milk was killing babies left and right, the only option was finding another human to do it. This wasn't a fringe practice. For thousands of years across multiple continents, wet nursing was how wealthy families kept their babies alive. The poor just watched their children die. The scale is hard to grasp from our modern perspective. In 18th century France, roughly half of all babies born in Paris were sent to wet nurses in the countryside. Half. Thousands of infants leaving the city every year, handed over to women who would feed them for money. Many of those babies never came back. The mortality rates for wet-nursed infants were catastrophic, sometimes exceeding 50%. Parents knew this. They did it anyway because the alternatives seemed worse. Wet nursing created a market in human milk that operated according to brutal economic logic. Wealthy families could afford wet nurses who lived in their homes, attended exclusively to their charges, and were monitored constantly by the child's parents. Middle-class families hired nurses who took the baby into their own homes, often caring for multiple infants simultaneously while also feeding their own children. Poor families who somehow scraped together enough money for a wet nurse got the worst options. Women so desperately poor they'd take any payment to feed another child while their own starved. The wet nurses themselves occupied a strange position in the social hierarchy. They were simultaneously essential and despised, performing a service that kept aristocratic lineages alive while being treated as barely human by the families that employed them. Their own children were often weaned early or given animal milk, the same animal milk that everyone knew killed babies, so their mothers could sell their breast milk to wealthier families. The mortality rate among wet nurses' biological children was even higher than among the babies they fed for money. This created a kind of inverted economy of infant survival. Rich babies lived because poor babies died. Not metaphorically, literally. A wet nurse's own infant would be given inadequate nutrition so she could feed someone else's child. The biological resources that should have gone to her baby were sold to maintain the population of the wealthy. It was an explicit transfer of survival from one class to another, mediated through women's bodies and measured in dead babies. The arrangements themselves were often horrifying. Wet nurses were subjected to detailed contracts that controlled their diet, their behavior, their sexual activity, even their emotional state. The theory was that a nurse's milk would be affected by everything she ate, drank, felt, or did. So employers tried to regulate every aspect of her life. She couldn't drink alcohol or eat spicy food. She couldn't have sex because pregnancy would ruin her milk. She couldn't get upset or angry because those emotions would poison what she fed the baby. She was reduced to a milk-producing machine whose own humanity was irrelevant, except as it might contaminate the product she was selling. And yet, the babies still died. Even the wealthy ones with dedicated wet nurses living in their homes died at rates that would be considered catastrophic today. The slightly less wealthy ones who were sent to nurses in the countryside died at rates that constituted demographic catastrophe. The practice that was supposed to solve the infant feeding problem was itself killing babies almost as effectively as animal milk. Part of this was simple logistics. Wet nurses often fed multiple babies simultaneously, and there's only so much milk a woman can produce. The babies were underfed, even when the nurse was trying her best. But much of it was neglect, abuse, and a system that valued profit over infant survival. Nurses took on more babies than they could feed because they needed the money. They gave babies opium to keep them quiet. They fed them supplementary animal milk that made them sick. When babies died, they'd report it to the parents and take on another client. The turnover was factored into the business model. The geographic separation between parents and babies made everything worse. Families who sent their infants to wet nurses in the countryside might visit once or twice during the nursing period, if at all. The baby was essentially gone for 2 or 3 years. If it survived, it would return as a toddler who didn't recognize its parents. If it died, the parents would receive a letter and a bill for services rendered up until the death. The emotional distance this created was both cause and effect of the high mortality. Parents couldn't afford to bond too strongly with infants who might not survive, which made them more willing to send those infants away, which made survival less likely. There were critics at the time who pointed out how insane this system was. Doctors wrote treatises condemning wet nursing and advocating for maternal breastfeeding. Philosophers argued that sending babies away damaged both infant and mother. Religious leaders preached that mothers had a duty to feed their own children. None of it mattered because the economic and social pressures that created wet nursing weren't addressed by moral arguments. Upper-class women couldn't breastfeed because it would tie them to the home during years when they were supposed to be cementing family alliances, managing households, and producing more heirs as quickly as possible. Breastfeeding delays the return of fertility, which meant a woman who nursed her own child might only produce 5 or 6 children in her reproductive lifetime instead of 10 or 12. For families where succession and alliances depended on having multiple children, this was unacceptable. The babies died so the family line could continue. Individual infant survival mattered less than demographic strategy. Middle-class women couldn't breastfeed because they had to work. This wasn't a matter of career ambition. Their labor was necessary for family survival. A shopkeeper's wife who spent 2 years primarily focused on nursing couldn't also be running the shop, managing accounts, and handling customers. A craftsman's wife who nursed full-time couldn't be doing the household manufacturing that supplemented family income. These women weren't choosing between baby and career. They were choosing between this baby surviving versus the whole family eating. The poor couldn't afford wet nurses at all, which meant they either nursed their babies themselves and accepted the economic consequences, or they tried to feed infants with animal milk and watched them die. The women who became wet nurses were usually the ones whose own babies had died, freeing up their milk to be sold, or who deliberately weaned their own children early to take advantage of their body's milk production while it lasted. Either way, someone's baby was dying to feed someone else's. The wet nursing system persisted for thousands of years despite everyone knowing it killed babies, because it solved a problem that agricultural civilization created but couldn't fix. Mothers needed to work. Babies needed to eat. Society needed population growth. These requirements were fundamentally incompatible, and wet nursing was the horrible compromise that allowed all three to sort of happen at once, as long as you were willing to accept catastrophic infant mortality as the price. What's striking from historical records is how matter-of-fact everyone was about this. Wet nursing contracts discussed payment, duration, and what to do when the baby died, not if. Parish records tracked infant deaths with the same administrative precision they tracked births. Families planned for child mortality the way we plan for taxes. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a budget item. This wasn't because people didn't love their children. It was because the structure of society made infant death so common that treating each one as a unique catastrophe would have been psychologically unsustainable. The practice only declined when industrialization and public health improvements made bottle feeding less lethal. Once you could reliably produce clean animal milk, heat it to kill bacteria, and feed it to babies in sterilized bottles, wet nursing lost its main advantage. It was still expensive, still required finding and managing another person, and still carried risks. Bottles were cheaper, more convenient, and by the early 20th century, almost as safe. The market for wet nurses collapsed not because society suddenly decided mothers should feed their own babies, but because industrial technology offered a better solution to the same problem. Even then, wet nursing didn't entirely disappear. It persisted in modified forms like milk banks, where women donate or sell breast milk that's distributed to babies whose mothers can't or don't breastfeed. The technology changed, but the underlying issue remained. Some mothers can't produce enough milk. Some babies need more than their mothers can provide. Society still hasn't figured out how to make maternal feeding work for everyone, so we still rely on some version of transferring milk from one mother's baby to another. The wet nursing era reveals something important about how we think about infant feeding. We treat it as a personal, private matter between mother and child. History shows it's actually a structural problem that societies solve collectively, usually badly. For thousands of years, the solution was paying some women to feed other women's babies, accepting that this would kill a lot of babies in the process, and treating the whole arrangement as normal. We've improved the technology, but we haven't fundamentally changed the equation. Babies need frequent feeding. Mothers need to do other things. Something has to give. Looking at wet nursing also demolishes the idea that there's something natural or traditional about mothers exclusively feeding their own babies. For most of recorded history in agricultural societies, wealthy mothers specifically did not feed their own babies. That was considered low-class behavior. Upper-class women were expected to hand their infants to wet nurses within days of birth. The baby might not return home for years. This was normal. This was traditional. The nuclear family with mother exclusively providing infant care is a modern invention, and not a particularly old one. The assumption that mothers should feed their own babies only became dominant when bottle feeding became safe enough to make wet nursing unnecessary. Before that, anyone who could afford to outsource infant feeding did so. The idealization of maternal breastfeeding came after the practice stopped being necessary for upper-class survival. Once wealthy women no longer needed wet nurses, they could afford to romanticize direct maternal care. The poor had always done it out of necessity. Now the rich could do it as a lifestyle choice and call it natural. This pattern repeats throughout history. Practices that the poor do because they have no choice get rebranded as virtuous once the wealthy start doing them voluntarily. Maternal breastfeeding, home birth, cloth diapers. All of these were markers of poverty before they became markers of particular parenting philosophies. The difference is choice. When you have no options, it's deprivation. When you choose it despite having options, it's commitment to your values. The practice looks identical, but the meaning inverts completely. Wet nursing shows this dynamic in stark relief. For thousands of years, feeding your own baby marked you as too poor to afford help. Then, bottle feeding became safe and wet nursing declined. Suddenly, maternal breastfeeding became valorized as the natural, bonding, healthiest choice. The practice that used to signal poverty now signals education and health consciousness. The reversal happened within a century, and nobody seems to notice the contradiction. What hasn't changed is that infant feeding remains a problem without a good solution. We've just shifted who bears the costs. Wet nursing transferred the costs to wet nurses and their biological children. Modern exclusive breastfeeding transfers the costs to mothers who have to choose between feeding their babies and participating in economic life. Formula feeding transfers the costs to families who have to pay for expensive products and navigate the health risks of imperfect nutrition. Every solution creates new problems. We've just gotten better at pretending otherwise. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how we made things, it changed what we expected mothers to be able to do. Before factories, most production happened in or near the home. Women worked, absolutely, but they worked in spaces where babies could exist nearby. A baby could sleep in a basket while its mother spun thread, weeded the garden, or prepared food. The work was hard and the baby was probably ignored more than modern parents would find acceptable. But physical proximity was possible. Factories ended that. Production moved to centralized locations with fixed hours and dangerous machinery. You couldn't bring a baby into a textile mill. The noise alone would be devastating, and the machinery could kill a child in seconds. Women who needed to work faced an impossible choice. Figure out infant feeding without being present, or don't work. Many working-class women had no choice at all. They worked because their families would starve otherwise. This created the modern crisis of infant feeding. It's not that women suddenly needed to be away from their babies. Women had always worked, but the nature of work changed in ways that made babies incompatible with earning money. At exactly the moment when families needed more cash income to survive urban industrial life, the structure of wage labor made it impossible to keep babies nearby. The wealthy solved this the way they always had, hiring wet nurses. But wet nursing couldn't scale to accommodate every working-class mother who needed to be in a factory 10 hours a day. There weren't enough wet nurses. The pay was too low to attract enough women. And the working-class families who needed childcare, most couldn't afford private wet nurses anyway. So cities developed institutional solutions. Foundling hospitals, orphanages, and baby farms took in infants whose mothers couldn't care for them. These institutions hired wet nurses, but not enough of them. The ratios were disastrous. One wet nurse might be responsible for 6 or 8 babies. She couldn't possibly feed them all adequately. Most of these babies died. Everyone knew this. They called foundling hospitals slaughterhouses of the innocents, and meant it literally. The death rate in some institutions exceeded 80%, but the factories still needed workers, and working mothers still needed somewhere to put their babies during the day, so the system continued. The deaths were treated as tragic, but inevitable. What else could society do? The mothers had to work. The babies had to be somewhere. If most of them died, well, that was just the cost of industrial progress. This is where we get the idea that the past had higher infant mortality because medicine was worse. That's true, but incomplete. Infant mortality was also high because we organized society in ways that killed babies. We built economic systems that required mothers to be separated from infants for long stretches, then acted surprised when the babies died from inadequate feeding. The first infant formula was invented in the mid-1800s as a response to this crisis. Justus von Liebig created a powdered formula made from cow's milk, wheat flour, malt flour, and potassium bicarbonate. It was marketed as an alternative to wet nursing. The idea was that if you couldn't breastfeed and couldn't afford a good wet nurse, you could mix up this powder and keep your baby alive. The early formulas were terrible. They lacked essential nutrients, caused digestive problems, and frequently led to disease because they had to be mixed with water that was often contaminated. Babies fed on early formula died at much higher rates than breastfed babies, but they died at lower rates than babies in foundling hospitals. For desperate mothers, formula was a gamble with better odds than the available alternatives. The technology improved slowly. By the early 1900s, formula manufacturers had figured out how to evaporate milk to make it shelf-stable, which helped with distribution. They added vitamins when those were discovered in the 1910s and 20s. Gradually, formula feeding became less immediately lethal. It still wasn't great, but it was survivable. The real breakthrough came with sterilization and refrigeration. Once families had access to clean water, the ability to boil bottles, and refrigerators to store prepared formula safely, the death rate for formula-fed babies dropped dramatically. By the 1950s, in developed countries, formula feeding was nearly as safe as breastfeeding in terms of immediate infant survival. That's when formula use exploded. This was marketed as liberation. Women's magazines ran articles celebrating how modern mothers could feed their babies scientifically, with precise measurements and sterile technique. Formula was positioned as more advanced than breastfeeding, more controllable, more modern. Doctors recommended it. Hospitals gave out free samples. For the first time in human history, a mother could be completely separated from her infant for days at a time, and the baby would be fine. The catch, which took decades to fully understand, was that formula wasn't quite as good as breast milk. It was close enough that babies survived and grew, but not identical. Breastfed babies had slightly lower rates of various infections and diseases. The differences weren't huge at the individual level, but they were real, and they were measurable across populations. By the 1970s, research had accumulated, showing that breastfeeding provided immune benefits that formula couldn't replicate. Public health organizations began promoting breastfeeding again. This created a new set of contradictions. We'd built an entire economic system on the assumption that mothers would work outside the home. We'd developed formula specifically so that mothers could do that. Now we were telling mothers that actually they should breastfeed for at least a year, preferably longer. But we didn't change the economic system. We didn't make it possible for mothers to stay home with babies for a year. We didn't create workplace cultures where women could breastfeed or pump milk comfortably. We just added breastfeeding to the long list of things mothers were supposed to do perfectly while also doing everything else. This is where we are now. Breast is best, the slogan says. Breastfeeding is promoted as the optimal choice for infant health, but women are still expected to work. Maternity leave in the United States averages 10 to 12 weeks, if you get any at all. Pumping breast milk at work is theoretically protected by law, but practically difficult and stigmatized. Many workplaces have nowhere private to pump. Many jobs don't have schedules that accommodate pumping every few hours. Many women find pumping painful or can't produce enough milk that way. So women face an impossible optimization problem. Maximize infant health outcomes by breastfeeding as long as possible, but also maximize family economic security by returning to work quickly and performing at a high level. You can't do both perfectly. Something has to give. Usually it's the mother's sleep, mental health, or career trajectory. The response from public health has been to double down on promoting breastfeeding while treating the structural barriers as someone else's problem. Lactation consultants will help you figure out better pumping schedules. Parenting books will teach you to cluster feed at night so you can be away longer during the day. Support groups will encourage you to persevere through pain and exhaustion. But nobody's changing the fact that your job expects you back in 10 weeks and doesn't really care about your milk supply. This creates a class divide in feeding practices. Women with flexible, high-status jobs can often breastfeed longer. They have offices with doors. They have some control over their schedules. They can afford high-quality breast pumps and all the accessories. Their partners often earn enough that they could theoretically take more time off without financial disaster, even if they don't. Women in hourly jobs, retail work, food service, or any position without workplace flexibility can't do this. They go back to work fast because they need the money. They don't have private spaces to pump. They can't take breaks whenever their breasts hurt. They switch to formula or combination feeding by necessity, then get told they're not doing what's best for their babies. The same pattern as wet nursing, just inverted. Now, the practice that wealthy women can maintain through superior resources gets coded as morally superior. Poor women who can't breastfeed as long due to economic constraints get implicitly blamed for their babies' health outcomes. The structural problems that make breastfeeding incompatible with most forms of employment get treated as individual failures of commitment. Studies show that breastfeeding promotion campaigns increase anxiety and guilt among mothers who can't or don't breastfeed, without actually increasing breastfeeding rates much. The women who can breastfeed do so slightly longer. The women who can't still can't, but now they feel worse about it. We've successfully made infant feeding more stressful without making it more accessible. The weird thing is how little we talk about this as a political or economic issue. Infant feeding gets discussed as personal choice, medical advice, or parenting philosophy. It rarely gets discussed as labor policy. But that's what it is. The question of how babies get fed is directly downstream of decisions about working hours, parental leave, workplace flexibility, and childcare support. Countries that have long paid parental leave and cultural support for breastfeeding have higher breastfeeding rates. This isn't because their women are more committed or better educated about the benefits. It's because they've made it structurally possible to breastfeed without sacrificing your economic survival. When you give women actual time with their babies and don't penalize them economically for taking it, more of them breastfeed. Shocking. But in the United States, we've decided that's not our approach. We want mothers to breastfeed, but we won't change anything structural to support it. We'll educate women about the benefits, and then send them back to jobs that make breastfeeding nearly impossible. When they quit breastfeeding earlier than recommended, we'll collect data on the health impacts and use it to promote breastfeeding more aggressively. The cycle continues. Formula companies occupy a strange position in all this. They're simultaneously blamed for undermining breastfeeding and relied upon to feed millions of babies whose mothers can't breastfeed exclusively. The aggressive marketing of formula in the 1960s and 70s, especially in developing countries, definitely decreased breastfeeding rates and led to preventable infant deaths. That's well documented and genuinely bad. But the current situation where formula is heavily restricted in hospitals and women have to specifically request, it creates different problems. New mothers struggling with breastfeeding report feeling abandoned, like they're failing a test they didn't know they'd have to take. When supplementing with formula could prevent painful engorgement, dehydration in the baby, or complete exhaustion in the mother, making it artificially difficult to access, isn't helping anyone. We've created a system where the medical establishment withholds formula to encourage breastfeeding, even when the mother is in pain and the baby is screaming. This is supposed to be supportive. In practice, it often feels punitive. Women describe having to beg nurses for formula while their babies lost dangerous amounts of weight. The goal is protecting breastfeeding. The effect is traumatizing new mothers during an already vulnerable time. The alternative to wet nursing was supposed to be formula feeding that would make infant feeding simple and safe. Instead, we've created a situation where formula feeding is stigmatized and breastfeeding is mandatory but unsupported. Women are supposed to want to breastfeed, succeed at breastfeeding despite all structural barriers, and feel grateful for the opportunity. Anything less is framed as choosing convenience over your baby's health. This framing erases the actual constraints women face. It's not about convenience. It's about needing to work to pay rent. It's about jobs that don't accommodate pumping. It's about untreated tongue ties and insufficient milk supply and painful infections and complete physical exhaustion. It's about having a C-section and trying to breastfeed while you can barely move. It's about having twins or a premature baby or postpartum depression. None of these situations are about convenience. They're about survival. But the discourse around infant feeding treats any deviation from exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months minimum as a failure of maternal commitment. The structural barriers that make this impossible for most women get ignored. The focus stays on individual choice and individual responsibility. This is what makes the history of wet nursing so important to understand. It shows that infant feeding has always been a structural problem, not an individual one. The specific solutions change, but the underlying tension remains. Babies need frequent feeding. Mothers need to do other things. Society has to decide how to handle that conflict. For thousands of years, the solution involved paying some women to feed other women's babies and accepting high infant mortality as normal. We've changed the technology, but we haven't resolved the fundamental problem. The 20th century promised liberation through technology. Better formula, better bottles, better sterilization, better pumps. If we just engineered the right products, infant feeding would stop being a problem. Women could work. Babies would thrive. The tension between biological reality and economic necessity would simply dissolve through innovation. That didn't happen. What happened instead is we created new problems that look different but feel remarkably similar. The technology improved dramatically. The structural support disappeared almost entirely. We replaced wet nurses with formula and breast pumps, then acted surprised when women still struggled to feed their babies while participating in modern economic life. The breast pump is perhaps the perfect symbol of this failure. It was supposed to free women, let them provide breast milk without being physically present, the ultimate technological solution to an ancient problem. In practice, pumping is often described by women as one of the most dehumanizing experiences of early motherhood. You're hooked up to a machine that pulls milk from your body while you sit in a bathroom or storage closet at work, trying to meet the same productivity standards as your colleagues who aren't lactating. This is what freedom looks like now. The mechanics of pumping reveal how little thought went into making this actually work. You need to pump every few hours to maintain supply. Each session takes 20 to 30 minutes, not counting setup and cleanup. You need a private space with an electrical outlet and a door that locks. You need a refrigerator to store the milk. You need time to wash all the parts between sessions. You need your workplace to accommodate all of this without penalizing you for the time spent not working. Most workplaces do not accommodate this. The law requires providing break time and a private space. But there's no requirement that the breaks be paid or that your workload be adjusted. So, women pump on their lunch break and hope they can make up the work later. Or they pump less frequently than recommended and watch their supply drop. Or they quit breastfeeding earlier than they'd planned because maintaining it while working is genuinely impossible. The women who successfully pump at work tend to have jobs with autonomy and flexibility. Lawyers, professors, software engineers. They control their own schedules and have private offices. Even then, it's exhausting. For women in retail, food service, healthcare, manufacturing, pumping at work ranges from difficult to completely impossible. You can't leave a cash register or assembly line every 3 hours for half an hour. Your employer might provide a space and breaks because legally they have to, but your co-workers resent covering for you and your manager makes it clear that this arrangement is a problem. This is the technological solution we chose instead of supporting mothers directly. The pumping itself is uncomfortable at best and painful at worst. Early pumps were hospital-grade machines that worked well but cost thousands of dollars. Consumer pumps were cheaper but less effective. You'd sit there for 40 minutes and get 2 ounces while your baby could drain you completely in 10 minutes. The technology has improved, but it still doesn't replicate what a baby does. The suction pattern is wrong. The feedback loop is missing. Your body responds differently to a machine than to an infant. Women describe feeling like dairy cows. The comparison isn't subtle. You're literally hooked up to a milking machine, optimizing your output, measuring success in ounces. Some pumps even have settings named after dairy cows. The dehumanization is built into the design. And yet pumping is presented as empowering. You can work and breastfeed. You can have it all. Just attach this machine to your body several times a day and maintain the same professional standards as everyone else. The fact that this is grueling and degrading gets reframed as a minor inconvenience, a small price to pay for the benefits of breast milk. The alternative to pumping is being physically present with your baby every few hours for the first 6 months or longer, which means not working or working part-time or bringing your baby to work or paying someone else to bring your baby to you for feeding. None of these options are economically viable for most families, so women pump, or they supplement with formula and feel guilty about it, or they stop breastfeeding entirely and face judgment from healthcare providers, other mothers, and themselves. We've created a situation where the only way to follow the official feeding recommendations is to either not work or to attach yourself to a machine multiple times daily while maintaining full-time employment. This is presented as progress, as choice, as supporting mothers. The focus on individual solutions masks the systemic failure. If breastfeeding is so important, why don't we have paid parental leave longer than 6 weeks? Why don't workplaces accommodate nursing mothers beyond the bare legal minimum? Why is childcare so expensive that many women's entire salary goes toward paying someone else to watch their baby while they work? These aren't mysteries. Other countries solved these problems decades ago. They have long parental leaves, subsidized childcare, workplace protections for nursing mothers. Their breastfeeding rates are higher, and their mothers report less stress about infant feeding. The solutions exist. We've chosen not to implement them. Instead, we get breast pumps, better bottles, more efficient formula, individual technological solutions to structural problems. Each product promises to make infant feeding easier, while the underlying conditions that make it difficult remain unchanged. The wet nurse was a structural solution. We paid some women to feed other women's babies and accepted that this was necessary for society to function. It had serious problems, obviously, but at least it acknowledged the reality that babies need frequent feeding and mothers need to do other things. The solution was collective, not individual. Now we expect each woman to solve this problem herself through some combination of pumping, formula feeding, flexible work arrangements, family help, and sheer determination. When this doesn't work, we blame the individual woman for not trying hard enough, not being organized enough, not committing enough to breastfeeding, not finding a better job or better childcare or better support. The structural barriers get treated as fixed constraints that individuals must navigate rather than problems society should solve. This is how we've handled most caregiving work: childcare, elder care, disability care. We've decided these are private family responsibilities rather than collective social ones. Technology provides tools for individuals to manage these responsibilities more efficiently. But the fundamental burden stays private. Each family figures it out alone. Infant feeding is just the earliest and most visible example. Every new mother confronts this immediately. Your baby needs to eat every 2 to 3 hours. You need to sleep, work, and maintain your physical and mental health. How will you manage this? The answer is supposed to involve products you purchase and strategies you implement, not structural support from society. The result is that infant feeding becomes another thing mothers are supposed to optimize. You track feeds and outputs. You measure weight gain. You research the best bottles and the best formula and the best pumps. You join online groups where other mothers share their systems and strategies. You're constantly troubleshooting, adjusting, experimenting, trying to find the combination of products and practices that will make this manageable. This is exhausting before you add everything else. The sleep deprivation, the physical recovery from birth, the hormonal chaos, the learning curve of caring for a completely helpless human. And through all of this, you're supposed to feed your baby in a way that meets medical guidelines, while also managing everything else in your life. The technological solutions don't solve this. They just shift where the pressure lands. Instead of needing a wet nurse, you need a good breast pump and a workplace that tolerates pumping. Instead of needing formula, you need to successfully establish breastfeeding despite minimal support. Instead of community help, you need to purchase the right products and implement the right systems. Everything is individualized. Everything is your responsibility to figure out. And when it doesn't work, that's your failure. Not a systemic failure, yours. This is what makes the history of wet nursing useful. It shows that this problem isn't new, and the solutions we've chosen aren't inevitable. We decided that infant feeding is a private responsibility that women handle through consumer products rather than a collective responsibility that society handles through structural support. We could have made different choices. We could have long parental leaves, subsidized childcare, workplace protections that actually work, community support systems. We could treat infant feeding as something society helps with, rather than something each mother manages alone. We chose not to do that. We chose breast pumps and formula and individual responsibility instead. The question is why? Why did we choose to make this harder rather than easier? Why do we accept that new mothers are exhausted and overwhelmed and barely surviving? Why do we treat postpartum as a private ordeal rather than a collective responsibility? Part of the answer is that supporting mothers requires public resources. Paid leave costs money. Subsidized childcare costs money. Workplace accommodations cost money. It's cheaper to tell women to buy a breast pump and figure it out themselves. But it's more than just money. There's an ideological commitment to keeping caregiving private, to making it women's responsibility specifically, to treating motherhood as a personal choice that comes with obligations rather than a social necessity that deserves support. If we actually supported mothers structurally, we'd have to acknowledge that raising children benefits everyone, not just individual families. We'd have to treat reproductive labor as real labor that deserves compensation and support. We'd have to recognize that the current system only works because women absorb enormous costs and stress to make it function. That recognition would require changing a lot more than infant feeding practices. It would mean rethinking how we value care work, how we structure employment, how we distribute resources. Much easier to sell breast pumps and call it feminism. The wet nurse represented an older understanding where raising children was clearly recognized as work that needed to be paid. The wet nurse got wages. The biological mother got freed time. Everyone acknowledged this was a transaction involving labor and compensation. Now we pretend infant feeding isn't work. It's bonding. It's natural. It's what mothers do. The fact that it requires constant physical presence and significant time and energy gets romanticized rather than compensated. You're not working when you feed your baby. You're nurturing, you're connecting, you're fulfilling your biological purpose. This framing makes it impossible to demand structural support. How can you ask to be paid for something that isn't work? How can you demand accommodations for something that's supposed to be natural and fulfilling? The wet nurse was hired help. The modern mother is supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to breastfeed. These framings lead to very different levels of support. The history of infant feeding reveals something uncomfortable about how we've organized society. We moved from a system where wealthy women paid other women to feed their babies to a system where all women are expected to do it themselves, and we called that progress. But progress for whom? The wet nurse got paid. She had clear working conditions, defined hours, negotiated terms. She could leave when her contract ended. The arrangement was explicitly transactional, which meant both parties understood it as labour. When the wet nurse showed up, everyone knew she was working. When she finished, she went home. The boundary between work and life existed. Modern mothers don't get that boundary. Breastfeeding happens around the clock. There's no shift change, no coverage, no days off. You're on call constantly because the baby needs what only your body can provide. And because we frame it as bonding rather than labour, there's no language for saying you're exhausted or overwhelmed without sounding like a bad mother. The wet nurse could complain about working conditions without anyone questioning her love for children. She was an employee. Employees complain. That's normal. A mother who complains about breastfeeding gets told she's not grateful enough for the gift of motherhood. The fact that it's exhausting becomes evidence of personal failure rather than structural problem. This matters because how we frame things determines what solutions we imagine. If breastfeeding is sacred bonding, then the solution to difficulty is better attitude, more commitment, deeper connection. If breastfeeding is labour, then the solution is better working conditions, more support, shared responsibility. One framework puts all pressure on the individual. The other acknowledges collective responsibility. We chose the framework that puts pressure on individuals. We did this deliberately, not through conspiracy, but through thousands of small decisions about what counts as work and what counts as love. Each decision seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they created a system that makes new mothers individually responsible for solving problems that are fundamentally structural. Consider what happened when women entered the workforce in large numbers. Society had a choice. We could restructure work to accommodate the fact that humans need care when they're young. Or we could tell mothers to figure out how to manage both work and caregiving without changing either system. We chose the second option. We created the breast pump. The breast pump is presented as liberating technology. It lets women breastfeed while working. It solves the problem of incompatible demands. Except it doesn't solve anything. It just shifts the burden. Now, instead of choosing between breastfeeding and work, you do both. You pump in bathroom stalls or storage closets during breaks you don't really have. You wash pump parts in office sinks. You store milk in communal refrigerators next to someone's leftover lunch. You arrange your entire day around maintaining supply. And you do all of this while pretending it's not a massive additional burden. Because you're supposed to be grateful for the flexibility. The wet nurse didn't pump. She fed the baby directly, or she didn't feed the baby at all. Her labour had clear boundaries. You paid her to be present, or you didn't. Modern mothers are expected to be functionally present through extracted milk, even when physically absent. The technology doesn't free you. It extends your obligation. This is what passes for progress. We eliminated paid infant feeding and replaced it with unpaid infant feeding plus mechanical extraction. We removed the transaction that made caregiving visible as labour and replaced it with technology that makes caregiving invisible as work. The wet nurse was clearly working when she fed a baby. The mother pumping in a bathroom stall is technically on a break. See the difference? See the What's fascinating is how we talk about these changes. The disappearance of wet nursing gets framed as women reclaiming motherhood from commercial intrusion. The natural bond between mother and child gets restored. Babies get the benefits of maternal milk and maternal presence. Everyone wins. But did everyone win? The wealthy women who previously hired wet nurses lost a convenience, but they gained social approval for being more involved mothers. The poor women who previously worked as wet nurses lost income and gained nothing. They still needed money. They still needed work. They just couldn't earn it feeding other people's babies anymore. Where exactly is the victory? The victory is ideological, not material. We decided that babies should be fed by their biological mothers whenever possible. We decided this was more natural, more moral, more correct. And once we decided that, we built systems that enforce it regardless of what individual women might want or need. The enforcement happens through guilt. If you don't breastfeed, you're denying your baby optimal nutrition. If you don't breastfeed long enough, you're cutting short a critical bonding period. If you supplement with formula, you're taking the easy way out. If you hire help, you're outsourcing motherhood. The message is clear. Good mothers feed their own babies. Anything else is compromise. But here's what that message obscures. Feeding babies is hard. It's physically demanding. It requires constant availability. It's incompatible with most employment. It's exhausting, even under ideal circumstances. And circumstances are rarely ideal. Some women struggle with supply. Some babies struggle to latch. Some mothers have health conditions that make breastfeeding painful or impossible. Some families need 2 incomes and don't have generous parental leave. Some women simply don't want to breastfeed. All of these situations are normal. They're predictable. They affect millions of women. But instead of building systems that accommodate these realities, we tell individual women to overcome them through better planning, stronger commitment, more sacrifice. The wet nurse got paid to handle difficulty. Modern mothers are expected to handle it through willpower. This is the core deception. We eliminated a system where infant feeding was recognized as work that deserved compensation. We replaced it with a system where infant feeding is sacred duty that women perform out of love. The first system was honest about what it demanded. The second system hides demands behind romance. When you hire someone to do something, you acknowledge its work. You negotiate terms. You set boundaries. You compensate effort. When you tell someone they should want to do something out of love, you remove all those protections. How can you negotiate boundaries around something you're supposed to desire? How can you demand compensation for something that's supposed to be its own reward? The genius of modern infant feeding ideology is that it makes demands invisible by framing them as fulfillment. You're not being forced to breastfeed. You're being given the opportunity. You're not being burdened with round-the-clock responsibility. You're being blessed with closeness. The fact that you're exhausted and overwhelmed isn't a sign that the demands are unreasonable. It's a sign that you haven't fully embraced the joy of motherhood. This framing makes collective solutions impossible. If the problem is your attitude rather than the structure, then the solution is changing your perspective rather than changing the system. Read more books about breastfeeding. Join support groups. Practice self-care. Adjust your expectations. The problem and the solution both live inside your head. Meanwhile, the structural problems remain untouched. Parental leave is still inadequate. Childcare is still unaffordable. Workplaces still expect full availability. Healthcare still treats postpartum as a brief recovery period rather than an extended transition. Communities still don't have robust support systems for new parents. None of this changes because we've defined it as a collection of individual challenges rather than systemic failure. The wet nurse made the labour visible. Someone was being paid to be present, to feed the baby, to provide care. The transaction was clear. Everyone understood resources were being allocated to support infant feeding. When wet nursing disappeared, that clarity disappeared too. Now the labour happens invisibly. The resources come from women's unpaid time and energy, and the whole arrangement gets called natural. Natural is a convenient word. It makes historical choices seem like biological inevitabilities. It makes socially constructed arrangements seem like facts of nature. When something is natural, you can't argue with it. You can't demand it be different. You just accept it and adjust. But there's nothing natural about how we currently handle infant feeding. It's a specific arrangement that emerged from specific historical circumstances. We could have made different choices. Other societies did make different choices. The fact that our approach feels inevitable to us just means we've successfully naturalized it. Other cultures have extended family networks that share feeding responsibilities. Some have communal childcare where multiple adults help with infants. Some have long parental leaves that give both parents time to establish feeding routines. Some have strong workplace protections that allow flexibility without penalty. These aren't utopias. They're just places that made different decisions about how to distribute the work of raising children. We decided to make it primarily individual responsibility. We decided to make it primarily women's responsibility. We decided to provide minimal structural support and maximum individual choice. Then we act surprised that women are struggling. The struggle isn't failure, it's the predictable outcome of the system we built. When you tell people to figure out impossibly complex logistics on their own, many of them will struggle. When you provide inadequate support and then blame individuals for not managing, you create widespread suffering. The suffering isn't accidental, it's structural. What makes this particularly cruel is that we have the resources to do better. We're not a poor society. We could afford generous parental leave. We could afford subsidized childcare. We could afford workplace protections that actually protect. We could afford community support systems. We choose not to allocate resources that way. We choose instead to leave each family to solve these problems individually through whatever combination of money, family help, and personal sacrifice they can cobble together. This arrangement works beautifully for some people. Those with money, flexible jobs, supportive partners, nearby family, and easy breastfeeding experiences do fine. The system isn't designed for them to suffer. It's designed to let them succeed while maintaining the illusion that success comes from individual virtue rather than structural advantage. Everyone else struggles in isolation, convinced their difficulty is personal failure. They don't see that the system is rigged against them. They see that other people manage, so clearly it's possible, which means their struggle must be their fault. This is how structural problems become internalized as individual inadequacy. The wet nurse at least knew she was working. She could see her labor, measure her hours, demand her wages. Modern mothers work just as hard, but the work is invisible. It doesn't count as labor because it's done out of love. It doesn't deserve compensation because it's natural. It doesn't require support because it's supposed to be fulfilling. Every part of that logic is a lie designed to extract unpaid labor while preventing collective organization. As long as infant feeding is sacred individual duty, mothers can't demand structural change. They can only try harder individually. They can only blame themselves when they fall short. They can only suffer privately while pretending publicly that everything is fine. The history of wet nursing shows us what we lost. Not the specific practice, which had its own problems, but the clarity. The acknowledgement that feeding babies is work that requires resources. The understanding that caregiving is labor that deserves support. The recognition that raising children benefits society, not just individual families, and therefore society should contribute. We lost that clarity deliberately. We replaced it with romance and responsibility and guilt. We made infant feeding invisible as work, so we wouldn't have to pay for it or support it structurally. We called this liberation. We called this progress. We called this natural. But it's none of those things. It's just cheaper. Cheaper to sell products than provide support. Cheaper to invoke maternal instinct than build infrastructure. Cheaper to make each woman responsible than acknowledge collective obligation. The cost of that cheapness gets paid by mothers. In exhaustion, in isolation, in the grinding daily work of meeting impossible demands with inadequate support. The cost gets paid in silence because we've made it shameful to admit struggling with something that's supposed to be natural and fulfilling. That cost gets paid in bodies that break down from chronic sleep deprivation, in mental health that deteriorates under relentless pressure, in careers that stall because someone has to handle the feeding and it's always the person with breasts, in relationships that crack under the weight of unequal labour and unspoken resentment, in the quiet desperation of trying to meet standards designed to be unachievable. The wet nurse could quit. That was always an option. She could say, "This job is too demanding, the pay isn't worth it, I'm done." The modern mother can't quit. Quitting means your baby doesn't eat. Quitting means you're a bad mother. Quitting isn't actually an option, which means you're not a worker with rights. You're just responsible, endlessly, exhaustingly responsible. This matters because we're watching it happen again. Right now, with formula shortages, with contamination scares, with supply chains breaking down. When crisis hits, we see clearly how fragile the system actually is, how dependent we've become on corporate supply chains to perform what used to be either bodily function or paid labour, how quickly choice becomes scrambling to find anything that works. During the 2022 formula shortage, parents drove hours searching for supplies. They diluted formula dangerously to make it stretch. They tried to relactate after months of not breastfeeding. They joined online groups trading formula like contraband. They panicked because suddenly the invisible infrastructure they depended on became visible through its absence. The response from experts was predictable. If you'd been breastfeeding, this wouldn't be a problem. As if the shortage was somehow punishment for making the wrong choice. As if parents using formula had been reckless rather than working within a system that made formula necessary for survival. Nobody said if we had adequate parental leave, this wouldn't be a problem. Nobody said if we had workplace protections, this wouldn't be a problem. Nobody said if we supported breastfeeding structurally instead of just ideologically, this wouldn't be a problem. Because that would require admitting the problem isn't individual choices, it's systemic failure. We've built a feeding system that depends on either biological function working perfectly or corporate supply chains working perfectly. Both are fragile. Both fail regularly. But instead of building resilience through structural support, we just blame parents when fragility becomes visible. The Victorian wet nurse worked within a system that acknowledged babies need feeding and feeding requires resources. Her labour was visible. Her working conditions were debatable. Her wages were negotiable. The system had problems, absolutely, but it had clarity about what was happening. Someone was working to feed a baby. That work had value. That value should be compensated. We lost that clarity without gaining anything better. We made the work invisible while keeping it just as demanding. We removed compensation while increasing expectations. We eliminated the professional relationship while maintaining all the labour. Then we called this progress. This is what happens when you romanticize labour to avoid paying for it. You don't make the labour go away. You just make it unpaid. You don't reduce the demands. You just remove the structural support. You don't liberate people from work. You trap them in work they can't acknowledge as work. Modern mothers do more feeding labour than wet nurses ever did. They research constantly. They track output obsessively. They troubleshoot problems endlessly. They manage medical appointments, lactation consultants, online groups, advice from family, contradictory guidance from experts. They make decisions with inadequate information and inadequate support. They carry responsibility that used to be distributed across multiple people and institutions. The wet nurse had one job: feed the baby. She didn't have to research the optimal feeding schedule. She didn't have to defend her choices to relatives. She didn't have to optimize for baby's development, mother's mental health, family finances, environmental impact, and social expectations simultaneously. She just fed the baby and got paid. That narrow scope made her exploitable in specific ways. She could be underpaid, overworked, fired arbitrarily. Those were real problems requiring real solutions through better labour protections. But at least the problem was visible. At least everyone acknowledged she was working. At least there was a relationship where negotiations could happen. Modern mothers can't negotiate because they're not workers. They're just mothers. The work is invisible because it's natural. The demands are unquestionable because they're for the baby. The lack of support is normal because motherhood is sacrifice. There's nothing to negotiate because officially nothing is happening except love. This makes resistance nearly impossible. The wet nurse could organise with other wet nurses, could demand better conditions collectively, could strike if necessary. Modern mothers can't strike from motherhood, can't organise collectively around demands that aren't supposed to be demands, can't withdraw labour that isn't recognised as labour. Instead, they cope individually. They buy different products. They try different methods. They blame themselves for struggling. They compete with each other over who's doing it right. They perform satisfaction on social media while crying in bathroom stalls. They maintain the fiction that everything is fine, because admitting it isn't means admitting failure at something that's supposed to be natural. This is incredibly effective at preventing change. As long as the problem is individual mothers failing at individual execution, there's no collective problem requiring collective solution. There's just millions of separate women, each trying harder to meet impossible standards with inadequate support. The genius of this system is that it looks like freedom. You can choose breastfeeding or formula. You can choose pumping or not. You can choose sleep training or bed sharing. You can choose organic or conventional. So many choices. Such liberation. Except all the choices exist within a structure that provides no support regardless of what you choose. Choosing breastfeeding doesn't get you paid leave. Choosing formula doesn't get you affordable childcare. Choosing to pump doesn't get you workplace accommodations. Choosing anything doesn't change the fact that you're doing it alone with inadequate resources while being held responsible for optimizing your baby's entire future. The choices are real, but they're not freedom. They're just different ways of managing scarcity. Different strategies for surviving a system designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum support. Different brands of the same fundamental problem. The Victorian system was honest about the transaction. You pay money, you get feeding labor. The terms were exploitative, but at least they were visible. You could see what you were buying and what you were selling. You could recognize when the deal was unfair and demand better terms. Our system hides the transaction. You don't buy feeding labor, you just become a mother, and feeding happens naturally through love. Except it doesn't happen naturally. It happens through enormous invisible labor that nobody counts or compensates or even acknowledges as labor. The unfairness is just as real, but it's harder to name because officially there's no transaction happening. This matters for how we think about solutions. If the problem is that breastfeeding is hard, the solution is better education or support groups or lactation consultants. If the problem is that formula is expensive, the solution is coupons or WIC or generic brands. These solutions tinker with individual experiences while leaving the structure intact. But if the problem is that we've made infant feeding someone's invisible unpaid responsibility while providing no structural support, the solution looks completely different. The solution is paid leave, workplace protections, subsidized childcare, community support systems, universal healthcare, affordable housing, all the infrastructure that would make caregiving possible without destroying the caregiver. That solution costs money. Real money. Redistributed money. Money that currently goes to corporate profits and tax cuts and military spending. Money that would have to come from somewhere, which means someone would have to give something up. That's why we don't do it. Not because we can't afford it, because we've decided not to. Instead, we maintain the fiction that infant feeding is individual responsibility. We sell products to help mothers manage better individually. We offer advice to help them optimize their individual execution. We create support groups where they can share individual struggles. All of this maintains the illusion that with the right products and techniques and attitudes, individual mothers can succeed within the current structure. Some do succeed. That's important. The system isn't designed to destroy everyone. It's designed to let some people succeed through combination of resources and luck, while making everyone else feel like their failure is personal inadequacy. The successful ones prove the system works. The struggling ones prove they're not trying hard enough. This is exactly how you prevent collective action. Make success possible for some people through individual effort. Make those people visible as proof the system is fine. Make everyone else invisible in their individual struggles. Now you have competition instead of solidarity, aspiration instead of organization, individual optimization instead of collective demands. The wet nurse system had class conflict built into its structure. The employer wanted maximum labor for minimum wages. The worker wanted maximum wages for minimum labor. That conflict was visible and therefore negotiable. Sometimes the worker won. More often, the employer won. But at least there was a conflict everyone could see. Modern infant feeding has the same conflict, but it's invisible. Society wants maximum caregiving labor for minimum structural investment. Mothers want adequate support for the enormous labor they're doing. That conflict is just as real, but nobody can name it because officially, mothers aren't workers and caregiving isn't labor and there's no conflict. Just individual women either succeeding or failing at natural feminine duty. Making that conflict visible is the first step toward resolving it. Naming caregiving as labor, counting the hours, calculating the value, recognizing that someone is working and someone is benefiting from that work, and currently the worker is getting a terrible deal. Not because individual mothers are bad at negotiating, because the system is designed to prevent negotiation entirely. The wet nurse could say, "I want higher wages or I quit." She had leverage because her labor was visible and necessary. Modern mothers can't quit because quitting means your baby doesn't eat. They have no leverage because officially they're not working. They're just being mothers, just doing what comes naturally, just fulfilling their biological destiny. That's not an accident. That's design. When you make labor invisible, you eliminate the worker's ability to negotiate. When you call work love, you eliminate the basis for demanding compensation. When you frame caregiving as sacred duty, you eliminate the possibility of saying this is too much. I need help. Someone else should share this burden. Every time someone says breast is best, without acknowledging the labor required to make that work, they're participating in this system. Every time someone judges formula feeding without acknowledging the structural failures that made it necessary, they're maintaining this system. Every time someone praises maternal sacrifice without demanding structural support, they're perpetuating this system. The system doesn't need everyone to actively support it. It just needs most people not to question it, not to see the labor, not to count the hours, not to connect individual struggles to systemic problems, not to demand collective solutions to what they've been told are individual responsibilities. That's why the history matters, not because we should return to wet nurses, because understanding how we got here helps us see what's actually happening now, helps us recognize that the current system isn't natural or inevitable. It's constructed, it serves specific interests, it could be different. And the history shows us what different looks like. Not perfect, not utopian, but structurally honest about what was happening. The wet nurse system named the labor, counted the hours, negotiated the terms, acknowledged that infant feeding was work, not magic, that it required time, not just love, that someone was doing it and someone else was benefiting and therefore compensation was necessary. We don't need to resurrect that system. We need to resurrect that honesty. The current discourse around infant feeding is designed to prevent that honesty. Every conversation gets redirected into individual choices. Fed is best. Do what works for your family. No judgment. All of which sounds supportive but actually prevents us from discussing the structural problems that make individual choices so difficult. Because here's what nobody wants to say. The reason infant feeding is so hard for so many people isn't because they're making wrong choices. It's because they're being asked to do an impossible amount of labor with an impossible lack of support, and then told the problem is their attitude. A mother struggling to breastfeed while working full-time without adequate pumping breaks isn't experiencing a personal failure. She's experiencing a policy failure. A mother choosing formula because she's drowning in postpartum depression isn't making a feeding choice. She's making a survival choice in a system that refuses to treat maternal mental health as serious healthcare. A mother exclusively breastfeeding while experiencing pain, exhaustion, and isolation isn't succeeding at motherhood. She's enduring a system that extracts maximum labor while providing minimum support and calls it empowerment. These aren't individual stories. They're symptoms of a system that deliberately makes caregiving labor invisible so it doesn't have to compensate for it. The wet nurse made that labor visible in ways that were impossible to ignore. When someone hands you money for feeding a baby, everyone understands that feeding a baby is work. When someone negotiates a contract that specifies hours and duties and compensation, everyone understands that this is labor with economic value. Modern motherhood strips away that clarity, makes the labor invisible, calls it bonding, calls it natural, calls it a choice, and then acts shocked when women burn out trying to do impossible amounts of unacknowledged, uncompensated work. The solution isn't shaming women for their feeding choices. The solution is making the labor visible again, counting it, valuing it, compensating it, sharing it. That means paid parental leave long enough that parents can actually establish feeding without choosing between income and infant health. That means workplace accommodations that treat pumping as necessary work time, not a personal favor. That means healthcare that acknowledges breastfeeding difficulties as medical problems requiring medical solutions, not moral failures requiring more willpower. That means mental health support that understands postpartum mood disorders aren't personal weakness, but predictable responses to impossible demands. That means formula access that doesn't require justification or apology, because feeding your baby isn't something you should have to defend. That means partner participation that's actually equal, not congratulated as exceptional. That means grandparent support that helps instead of judges. That means community structures that share caregiving labor instead of isolating individual mothers with individual babies in individual homes. That means childcare that's affordable and available and treated as public infrastructure, not luxury service. That means healthcare that's accessible and comprehensive and doesn't bankrupt families for the crime of reproducing. That means economic structures that don't punish women for the biological reality of gestation and lactation. That means social structures that don't treat caregiving as women's natural duty and men's optional hobby. None of this is impossible. We know it's possible because other countries do it. Countries with paid leave, subsidized childcare, universal healthcare, protected pumping time, supported breastfeeding, accessible formula. Countries where infant feeding is still labor and still difficult, but where the labor is acknowledged and the difficulty is shared. The United States chose a different path, chose to make caregiving labor invisible, chose to tell women that maternal sacrifice is beautiful, chose to frame systemic failures as individual responsibilities, chose to celebrate mothers who succeed despite impossible odds while ignoring the odds entirely. And it chose to disguise all of this as freedom, as choice, as empowerment. You can breastfeed or formula feed. You can stay home or work. You can hire help or do it yourself. Look at all these choices. Look at all this freedom. Isn't modern motherhood amazing? Except freedom without support isn't freedom. It's abandonment with better marketing. The wet nurse wasn't free in any meaningful sense. She worked because she needed money. She sold her labor because survival required it. Her choices were constrained by poverty, patriarchy, and limited options. Nobody's romanticizing that. But at least the labor was visible. At least the economic relationship was honest. At least when she was exploited, people could name it as exploitation instead of calling it maternal instinct. Modern mothers have more legal rights and fewer economic options, more theoretical choices and less practical support, more freedom to choose and less ability to make those choices work. Because all those choices require labor, and that labor has been made invisible. When labor is invisible, it's infinite. When work is called love, there's no limit to how much can be demanded. When caregiving is sacred duty, asking for help becomes selfishness. When motherhood is natural, struggling with it becomes personal failure. This isn't accidental. Making labor invisible is how you get people to do enormous amounts of work for no compensation. It's how you extract value without paying for it. It's how you make systemic problems look like individual inadequacies. The wet nurse system did this too. It extracted labor from poor women to benefit rich women. It created terrible working conditions and called them employment. It separated women from their own children so they could feed someone else's. It was exploitative and everybody knew it. The difference is they knew it. They could see the exploitation because the labor was visible and the economic relationship was clear. When wet nurses organized for better conditions, their demands made sense because everyone understood they were workers doing labor that had value. Modern mothers can't organize because officially they're not workers. They're just mothers, just doing what comes naturally, just making personal choices about their individual families. You can't strike when you're not employed. You can't negotiate when there's no employer. You can't demand better conditions when officially you're not working. You're just being a mother, and being a mother is supposed to be its own reward. That's the brilliance of making labor invisible. You eliminate the basis for collective action. You prevent workers from recognizing they're workers. You stop them from organizing because there's nothing to organize around. Just individual women making individual choices, and either succeeding or failing based on individual merit. Except they're not failing. The system is failing. And calling that failure individual choice is how the system protects itself from accountability. Every time someone says breast is best without saying, and here's the paid leave, affordable childcare, protected pumping time, and healthcare access that makes that possible, they're participating in this system. Every time someone celebrates maternal sacrifice without demanding structural support, they're maintaining this system. Every time someone frames infant feeding as individual choice without acknowledging collective responsibility, they're protecting this system. The history of wet nursing matters because it shows us what happens when caregiving labor is visible, when it's named as work, when it's compensated, when someone can say, this is my job, these are my hours, this is what I'm owed. The working conditions were often terrible. The pay was often inadequate. The power dynamics were deeply unequal. But at least the labor was acknowledged. At least the economic relationship was visible. At least exploitation could be named as exploitation. Modern motherhood has better rhetoric and worse reality. We've taken the labor and made it invisible. We've taken the exploitation and called it empowerment. We've taken the structural problems and framed them as personal responsibilities. And then we've congratulated ourselves for giving women choices while building a system that makes all those choices impossibly hard. The solution isn't returning to wet nurses. It's returning to honesty about the labor, about the time, about the cost, about who's doing the work and who's benefiting from it and who's paying for it and who's not. That honesty is uncomfortable because it reveals how much we're asking of mothers and how little we're giving them. How much we value their labor when we need it, and how little we compensate them for doing it. How much we depend on their unpaid work, and how much we resent them for asking for support. But that discomfort is necessary, because until we see the labor, we can't value it. Until we count the hours, we can't compensate them. Until we acknowledge the work, we can't share it. Until we name the exploitation, we can't end it. The wet nurse got paid because everyone could see she was working. Modern mothers don't get paid because we've successfully convinced everyone, including mothers themselves, that they're not working. They're just doing what comes naturally, just fulfilling their biological destiny, just making choices about their individual families. That lie protects everyone except the women doing the labour. It protects employers who don't have to provide leave or accommodations. It protects partners who don't have to share equally. It protects governments who don't have to fund support. It protects a society that depends on women's unpaid labour, but refuses to acknowledge that dependency. Breaking that lie requires making the labour visible again, counting every hour spent feeding, whether breast or bottle, calculating every night of disrupted sleep, tallying every pumping session, every doctor's appointment, every moment of worry and care and constant attention, adding up the actual cost of infant feeding in time, energy, money, career impact, health consequences. The number is enormous. The labour is staggering. The cost is unsustainable for any individual to bear alone, which is exactly why we've made it invisible. Because if people saw the real cost, they'd demand we share it. And sharing it would require structural change that nobody wants to pay for. So instead we celebrate maternal sacrifice and call it choice. We praise women who do impossible things and ignore the impossibility. We maintain a system that extracts maximum labour for minimum investment and frame it as freedom. We've built an entire culture around making mothers feel guilty for struggling with problems we've deliberately created and refuse to solve. That's not an accident. That's design. And understanding the history helps us see the design, helps us recognise that the current system isn't natural or inevitable. It serves specific interests. It could be different. It should be different. The wet nurse proved that caregiving labour can be visible, valued, and compensated. We don't need to replicate her working conditions. We need to replicate her clarity, the acknowledgement that feeding babies is work. Real work. Work that requires time and skill and energy. Work that has economic value. Work that deserves support and compensation and structural solutions, not just individual praise and collective abandonment. Looking back across tens of thousands of years, one thing becomes uncomfortably clear. We've never actually solved the problem of how to feed human infants in ways that don't require extraordinary sacrifice from someone. We just keep changing who pays the price and pretending that's progress. Forager societies had it figured out through extended breastfeeding, cooperative care, and social structures built around infant needs. Then agriculture happened, and we spent 10,000 years watching babies die from early weaning onto inadequate foods. We tried wet nurses and created a market where poor babies died so rich babies could live. We invented formula and spent a century perfecting it while destroying the structural supports that made breastfeeding possible. Now we have the technology to feed babies safely multiple ways, but we've built an economy that makes all of them unnecessarily difficult. The pattern is consistent. Every time we change how society is organised, we break the infant feeding system and then blame individual mothers for not making it work. Agricultural settlement broke the forager model. Industrialisation broke the agricultural adaptations. Modern capitalism broke the industrial solutions. Each time we act surprised that mothers are struggling. Each time we offer individual solutions to structural problems. Better products, better advice, better attitudes, never better support. What we've lost along the way isn't any specific practice. It's the honesty. Foragers knew feeding babies required constant availability and community support. They organised life accordingly. Agricultural societies knew babies needed to eat and mothers needed to work. They created wet nursing despite its problems, because at least it acknowledged the conflict. Industrial societies knew formula wasn't ideal, but recognised it as necessary given the constraints. They were honest about the trade-offs. We've lost that honesty. Now we pretend there's no conflict between infant needs and economic demands. We pretend individual choices can solve structural problems. We pretend maternal sacrifice is beautiful instead of acknowledging its exploitation. We pretend the system is fine and struggling mothers just need to try harder. The history shows us that's never been true. Whenever we've built societies that make caregiving difficult, babies and mothers have suffered. The suffering looks different across eras. Sometimes it's high infant mortality. Sometimes it's maternal exhaustion and isolation. Sometimes it's both. But it's always there, predictable consequence of organizing society, without adequate support for the biological reality of human infancy. Other countries prove different arrangements are possible. Paid parental leave, subsidized childcare, healthcare that treats breastfeeding problems as medical issues, workplace protections that acknowledge feeding takes time. These aren't utopian fantasies. They're policy choices that other societies have made. They don't solve everything, but they acknowledge the labor and provide structural support instead of just individual responsibility and collective judgment. The United States could make those choices. We have the resources. We lack the political will, because supporting mothers requires admitting that caregiving is work that deserves compensation, and that means confronting how much unpaid labor we currently extract from women under the guise of maternal instinct. That's the real lesson from wet nursing. Not that we should return to hiring women to feed other women's babies, but that when caregiving labor was visible and compensated, everyone understood it was work. Now that it's invisible and unpaid, we can extract infinite amounts of it while telling women they should be grateful for the opportunity. The breast versus bottle debates miss this completely. They focus on which feeding method is optimal, while ignoring that neither method works well without structural support. Breastfeeding is difficult when you have to return to work after 6 weeks. Formula feeding is difficult when it's stigmatized and expensive. Both are difficult when you're doing it alone without adequate sleep, healthcare, or help. The choice between breast and bottle isn't the problem. The isolation is the problem. The lack of support is the problem. The expectation that individual mothers will figure out impossible logistics while maintaining employment and managing households and optimizing child development is the problem. Solving that problem requires more than better products or better advice. It requires reorganizing society to acknowledge that raising children benefits everyone and therefore everyone should contribute. It requires treating caregiving as essential infrastructure instead of private responsibility. It requires compensating the labor instead of romanticizing the sacrifice. That's a much bigger project than just fixing infant feeding. It requires rethinking how we value care work generally, how we structure employment, how we distribute resources, how we define what society owes its members and what members owe society, which is probably why we don't do it. Much easier to sell breast pumps and call it empowerment. Much cheaper to blame individual mothers than build structural support. Much more comfortable to maintain the fiction that maternal instinct will overcome any obstacle than to admit we've built obstacles that shouldn't exist. But the history is clear. For most of human existence, we fed babies in ways that worked because society was organized around infant needs. Then we reorganized society around other priorities and spent thousands of years failing to feed babies adequately. We've only recently developed technology that makes survival possible despite structural failures. That's not the same as solving the problem. That's just making the problem survivable. The question is whether we're satisfied with survivable or whether we want actual solutions. Whether we're content telling mothers to try harder individually or whether we're willing to do better collectively. Whether we're okay with a system that makes some people succeed through extraordinary effort while making everyone else feel inadequate. The Foragers didn't have perfect lives. Infant mortality existed. Hardship was real. But they organized communal life around the biological needs of children. They made caregiving visible and shared. They understood that babies required enormous investment, and they structured everything accordingly. We've built a civilization that produces incredible wealth and technology, but can't figure out how to support new parents without destroying them. That's not inevitable. That's a choice. a choice we make every day by maintaining structures that extract unpaid labor while providing minimal support. A choice we could unmake by deciding that the people doing essential caregiving work deserve more than praise and sacrifice. They deserve time, resources, community, compensation, infrastructure. The wet nurse got paid because everyone could see she was working. Modern mothers work just as hard, but the labor is invisible. Making it visible again won't solve everything, but it's where solutions start. By counting the hours, acknowledging the cost, recognizing the work, demanding structural support instead of accepting individual responsibility. That's what the history teaches, not which feeding method is best. But that infant feeding has always been difficult, and societies either help or they don't. For hundreds of thousands of years, we help through community and cooperation. For the last 10,000, we've mostly told women to figure it out alone. We've developed better technology but worse support, better products but worse structures, better rhetoric but worse reality. Changing that requires honest about what we're asking of mothers and what we're giving them, about how much we depend on their labor and how little we compensate it, about the gap between what we say we value and what we actually support. The babies who were fed by wet nurses are long dead. The mothers who hired them are forgotten. The economic relationships that made it possible have disappeared. But the fundamental question remains unchanged. How do we feed human infants in ways that acknowledge the enormous labor required and provide adequate support for the people doing it? We still haven't answered that question. We've just gotten better at pretending it's not a question at all. That with the right attitude and products and personal choices, individual mothers can make it work. Some do. Most struggle. All of them deserve better than a system designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum support and calling it freedom. That's not progress. That's just a different version of the same old problem. And until we're willing to build structural solutions instead of selling individual products, until we're ready to compensate the labor instead of romanticizing the sacrifice, until we can acknowledge that caregiving is work that benefits everyone, and therefore everyone should help, we'll keep failing the same way we've been failing for thousands of years, just with better marketing.